Baby Triceratops follows human researcher. What happens next is unbelievable. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The sun hung low over the dense jungle, casting golden beams through the thick canopy. Dr. Alan Porter adjusted the strap of his field bag, his boots sinking slightly into the damp earth with each step. The air was humid and alive, the distant calls of unknown creatures echoing through the trees. This wasn't just any expedition, it was the most significant of his career. He had spent the past 3 years studying genetic anomalies in prehistoric ecosystems, tracking signs of what many deemed impossible. And today, his findings had finally brought him here, to a remote island, untouched by modern civilization, where the line between past and present seemed to blur. Alan crouched beside a set of tracks. Small, three-toed imprints pressed deep into the soft mud, leading further into the dense foliage. His pulse quickened. These were fresh. He reached into his bag, pulling out his camera, quickly snapping a few shots. The footprints were unlike anything seen before, the right size, the right shape. But they weren't from any species alive today. No, these were the tracks of a creature that had gone extinct millions of years ago. Alan rose to his feet, following the trail. The jungle grew thicker around him, the sounds of the forest intensifying. He stepped over fallen logs, brushed past hanging vines, his breath coming faster. Whatever he was tracking was close. Then a rustle. He froze. The leaves just ahead shuddered, parting slightly. Something small, but fast darted through the undergrowth. His fingers tightened around his camera. He barely had time to register movement before a tiny horned head peeked out from behind a thick fern. Alan's breath caught. It was impossible. Standing no more than 2 feet tall, staring at him with wide, dark, intelligent eyes, was a baby Triceratops. For a moment, neither of them moved. Alan's brain fought to rationalize what he was seeing. The creature's skin was a leathery mix of soft browns and mossy greens, its tiny frill adorned with barely developed ridges. Its little nostrils flared as it sniffed the air, its clawed feet digging into the soil as if uncertain whether to approach or flee. Alan's heart hammered. This was real. He slowly lifted his camera, his hands shaking. The lens focused, the viewfinder framing the impossible creature. A living, breathing Triceratops. And then a soft chirp. The baby Triceratops let out a tiny, curious sound, a mix between a grunt and a whimper. It tilted its head, taking a cautious step closer. Alan swallowed, forcing himself to remain still. His instincts screamed at him to retreat, to process the sheer impossibility of what he was witnessing. But another part of him, the scientist, the explorer, knew this was a moment he could never get back. The baby Triceratops sniffed at the air again, then, with surprising boldness, took another step forward. Alan barely breathed. The little creature chirped again, and before he could even react, it bumped its head gently against his boot. Alan let out a shaky exhale, lowering his camera slightly. The baby Triceratops wasn't afraid of him. It was curious. It let out another soft grunt before suddenly, it turned and trotted off. Alan's heart plunged. No, he couldn't just let it disappear. Not now. He hesitated only for a second before stepping forward, following. The baby Triceratops darted through the undergrowth, its tiny, stubby legs surprisingly fast. Alan ducked beneath vines, swerved past fallen branches, his breath coming quick. He barely registered the terrain changing until he suddenly stumbled into a wide, open clearing. And that's when he saw them. Not one, not two, but an entire herd. Alan came to an abrupt halt, his chest rising and falling rapidly. Before him, grazing peacefully under the dappled sunlight, stood a dozen fully grown Triceratops. Their massive horns curved gracefully, their thick, muscular bodies moving with slow, powerful ease. Some tore leaves from nearby trees, their frills shifting as they turned their great heads. Others lay in the shade, their eyes half closed. And among them were more young. Alan felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. A living herd of creatures from another time. The baby Triceratops he had followed let out an excited chirp and scampered toward the adults. One of the larger females, presumably its mother, turned her massive head. Alan froze. For a long moment, the adult Triceratops stared at him. Then she let out a deep, rumbling breath and returned to grazing. Alan let out a breath of his own. They weren't afraid of him. And that realization sent a shiver down his spine. How? How had this remained hidden? How had these creatures, so large, so ancient, so undeniably real, existed without detection? His mind spun with possibilities. Genetic experiments? An undiscovered sanctuary? A biological anomaly beyond human understanding? None of it made sense. And yet, here they were. Alan slowly lifted his camera, his fingers trembling. This was history. This was everything. And just as he prepared to take another photo, a deep, guttural roar shattered the air. Alan's blood ran cold. The Triceratops all froze. Heads snapped upward. Their muscles tensed. Another roar, closer this time. Alan's stomach dropped. They weren't alone. Alan's breath came short and shallow. His instinct screamed at him to run, hide, do anything but stand there like a sitting duck. But his feet remained rooted to the ground, his body locked in a stunned stillness. The Triceratops herd had shifted instantly. Their relaxed grazing turned into a defensive formation. The younger ones, like the baby he had followed, were being herded to the center. The adults, massive and unwavering, formed a protective barrier around them, their powerful legs stomping the earth, horns tilting outward. Another roar split through the jungle. Alan's pulse hammered in his throat. He knew that sound. Predator. And not just any predator. This one was big. The leaves ahead shuddered violently. Trees snapped. Something was coming fast. Alan backed up instinctively, but the crunch of his boot against the earth made one of the Triceratops, the massive female, snap her head toward him. Her deep, black eyes locked onto his form, nostrils flaring. She wasn't sure whether he was a threat or not. Alan lifted his hands, barely breathing. "I'm not here to hurt you," he whispered. A deep growl rumbled through the jungle. Closer now. The female huffed sharply, stomping a foot into the dirt. Alan swallowed hard. He needed to move. No, but then it emerged. The undergrowth burst open, and out stepped Death. A massive carnivore slithered into the clearing, its golden eyes locking onto the herd. Alan's breath caught in his chest. It wasn't a T-Rex, but it was just as deadly. A Majungasaurus, a lone hunter. Its scales shimmered dark green with patches of gray, its muscular frame rippling as it moved. Its powerful jaws hung slightly open, revealing jagged teeth stained with age and experience. It let out a deep guttural snarl, tilting its head as if assessing its options. Alan's hands trembled. Majungasaurus were ruthless. Unlike some carnivores that hunted in pairs or opportunistically scavenged, this one was a lone predator. It had no pack. It had no competition. It would not hesitate. The Triceratops herd stood their ground. The largest male at the front, a towering beast with a massive frill and scars from past battles, let out a deep bellowing cry. His front foot stomped down, sending a shockwave through the dirt. The Majungasaurus hissed in return, stepping forward. Alan's mind raced. He had no weapons, no protection. He wasn't part of this battle, but if he didn't move, he'd get caught in it. And then the Majungasaurus lunged. It was a blur of muscle and teeth. The alpha Triceratops charged to meet it head-on, horns aimed forward like a battering ram. The impact was thunderous, the two prehistoric titans colliding in a flurry of dust and snarls. Alan stumbled backward. The baby Triceratops he had followed, the one that had trusted him just moments ago, stood frozen nearby, too young to understand the danger. Alan's heart lurched. He had to move it. Another roar tore through the clearing as the Majungasaurus snapped at the older Triceratops, claws raking against armored frills. But it was too fixated on its prize, young ones. And one of them was too exposed. Alan's instincts took over. He bolted. The baby Triceratops let out a panicked squeak as Alan rushed toward it, heart hammering against his ribs. "Come on, move," he hissed. The little creature let out a confused chirp. Then, seeing Alan run, it ran too. The Majungasaurus noticed. Its golden eyes flicked toward them, and for one terrifying second, it changed direction. Alan's blood turned ice cold. He was now the target. The ground thundered beneath him as he ran, his muscles burning, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The baby Triceratops was fast, but clumsy, struggling to keep up. The Majungasaurus gained ground. Alan could hear it, the snarl, the pounding footsteps. His vision blurred. He wasn't going to make it. But then the female Triceratops charged. Like a guardian angel made of muscle and instinct, she plowed into the side of the Majungasaurus, sending it crashing into the dirt. The predator roared in rage, thrashing violently, but the herd moved in. Alan stumbled, nearly falling to his knees. He grabbed onto a nearby tree, chest heaving, eyes wide as he watched the incredible sight unfold. The Triceratops, united and enraged, drove the predator back. Horns slashed through the air. Stomps rattled the jungle floor. The Majungasaurus snarled desperately, snapping its teeth, but was outnumbered. It wasn't the apex here. With a final bitter snarl, it turned and fled, disappearing back into the shadows. Silence followed. Alan felt his knees nearly give out. The baby Triceratops bumped his leg, as if checking if he was still alive. Alan let out a breathless laugh. The female Triceratops, the one who had saved him, turned her massive head and looked right at him. And for the first time, Alan felt like she had accepted him. Not as a threat, not as a stranger, but as something else entirely. Part of the herd. Alan stood in the clearing, his breath still shaky. The jungle had returned to an eerie calm, the only sounds now coming from the Triceratops herd as they slowly relaxed after their battle. The baby Triceratops nuzzled against his leg again, as if checking if he was all right. He let out a small, nervous chuckle. "I should be the one checking on you, little guy." The female, the one who had intervened, the one who had saved them both, stood just a few feet away. She watched Alan closely, her nostrils flaring slightly as if sizing him up one last time. Then, to his complete astonishment, she turned away from him, not in dismissal, but in acceptance. She had deemed him safe. Alan swallowed hard, forcing his brain to catch up to what had just happened. He had come here searching for evidence, searching for a clue about how these creatures could exist. Instead, he had found something much bigger. He had found a place where they thrive. The realization sent a thrill through his bones. This wasn't just about science. This was a miracle. The herd had already begun to move again, shifting deeper into the jungle. They moved as one unit, silent communication passing between them with small grunts, snorts, and gestures of their frills. Alan felt something pull at him. A decision. He could leave now. He could return to his camp, report his findings, send the data to the world. But he looked down at the baby Triceratops, still lingering by his side. The little creature tilted its head. Alan exhaled. He had come this far. And if this herd was real, if these creatures were real, then what else was here? He adjusted the strap of his camera. There was only one way to find out. He followed them. At first, he kept a respectful distance, moving carefully to avoid disturbing their natural flow. But as the minutes passed, he realized something incredible. They weren't avoiding him. They weren't shooing him away. If anything, they had accepted his presence. Alan had spent years tracking modern herbivores, elephants, rhinos, even wild buffalo. He knew how protective large creatures could be of their young. And yet, here he was, walking among prehistoric giants. It wasn't just scientific discovery anymore. It was a connection. The deeper they traveled into the jungle, the more Alan's senses sharpened. The island was alive in a way that felt untouched by human hands. Massive ferns stretched toward the sky. Trees twisted in ancient formations. Strange bird-like calls echoed in the distance, some familiar, some completely alien. And then, just when he thought he couldn't be more amazed, he saw it. The jungle opened up into an impossibly large valley. Alan's breath hitched. It was a sanctuary. Far below, more dinosaurs roamed. Not just Triceratops, but stegosaurs, small theropods darting between trees, towering brachiosaurs moving like slow, living monoliths. It was an entire ecosystem, alive, thriving, hidden from the world. Alan felt his knees go weak. This place, it shouldn't exist. And yet, here it was. The baby Triceratops chirped excitedly beside him. Alan barely registered the sound. His mind was spinning. Who had kept this place hidden? And more importantly, why? Nightfall came faster than Alan expected. The herd had settled near a wide, shallow river, their massive bodies casting long shadows in the moonlight. Alan had chosen to stay nearby, setting up a small, cautious camp near a rock formation. It was risky, but he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. As he sat beside a small, controlled fire, his thoughts raced. How had this all remained untouched? The island, isolated, unknown to most of the world, wasn't marked on any modern maps. Was it government-controlled? A secret research site? Or was it something older? A long-forgotten place where nature had simply found a way? Alan exhaled, rubbing his hands together. The baby Triceratops had nestled beside him, dozing softly. It had chosen to trust him. That thought sent a strange warmth through his chest. He reached for his camera, flipping through the images he had taken. The proof was there, undeniable. And yet, part of him hesitated. He had spent his entire career trying to prove something like this existed. But now that he had found it, what was the right thing to do? A rustle in the bushes made him tense. Alan instinctively reached for his small field knife. Not that it would do much against a predator of this size. His pulse quickened. The Triceratops herd was calm, which meant whatever was moving wasn't a threat to them. Then, a figure stepped out of the shadows. Alan's breath caught. It was a human. A man dressed in dark tactical gear, holding a rifle. For the first time since arriving, Alan felt a wave of cold fear. He wasn't the only one who had found this place. And whoever this was, they had come prepared. Alan's breath stalled in his chest. The man in tactical gear stood at the edge of the firelight, his expression unreadable beneath the shadows. His rifle was held loosely at his side, but Alan wasn't naive enough to think that meant he wasn't a threat. The Triceratops herd remained calm, unbothered by the stranger's presence. That meant he had been here before. Alan slowly rose to his feet, keeping his hands visible. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer at first. His gaze swept over Alan, his camera, the sleeping baby Triceratops nestled beside him. He let out a quiet sigh, half amused, half exasperated. "I was wondering when someone like you would finally show up." Alan stiffened. "What does that mean?" The man took a step closer. "It means you're trespassing on something far bigger than you understand." Alan's mind raced. He had expected many things on this expedition: scientific discoveries, dangerous wildlife, even potentially hostile locals. But a hidden force protecting the island? That was new. The man motioned toward the jungle. "Come with me. It's not safe here." Alan hesitated. He glanced at the sleeping Triceratops. And them. The man exhaled. "They'll be fine. You, on the other hand, won't be if you stay out in the open when the sun rises." That sent a chill down Alan's spine. "What happens at sunrise?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned and disappeared into the jungle. Alan stood there, his instincts warring with logic. He had two choices: stay with the herd, continue observing them, risk whatever unknown threat was coming, or follow this man who clearly knew more about this island than he did. Alan took one last look at the baby Triceratops, then grabbed his camera and followed. The trek was silent and tense. The man moved with unpracticed ease, like someone who had spent years surviving in this environment. Alan, on the other hand, had to focus just to keep up, dodging thick vines and uneven terrain. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a clearing. Alan's breath hitched. It wasn't just a camp. It was a full-fledged research outpost. Metal structures loomed in the moonlight, camouflaged into the environment, silent and hidden from aerial detection. There were motion sensors, locked containers, security cameras tracking every angle. Alan stopped short. "What the hell is this place?" The man sighed, turning toward him. "It's called Project Genesis." Alan's blood ran cold. He had heard that name before. A whispered rumor. A classified operation buried under layers of misinformation. Scientists who had vanished. Billion-dollar funding that had no paper trail. It had always been dismissed as conspiracy. But now he was standing in the middle of it. Alan turned toward the man, anger flaring. "You knew this was here. You knew what was on this island." The man nodded. "And now, so do you." Alan's jaw tightened. "Who else knows?" The man's eyes darkened. "No one who leaves." Alan's stomach twisted. A threat. The implications were clear. He had seen too much. Before Alan could respond, a voice crackled through the man's radio earpiece. "Target is active." Tracking shows movement near Sector 7. Alan's pulse quickened. Target. The man cursed under his breath and turned sharply. Come on. We need to move. Alan planted his feet. No, not until you tell me what's really going on here. The man hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Fine. He turned toward Alan, eyes hard. We weren't the first to find this place, but we're the only ones left who know how to contain it. Alan frowned. Contain what? The man's next words sent a chill through his bones. Something bigger than dinosaurs. Alan's mind reeled. Bigger than dinosaurs? What could be more significant than living, breathing prehistoric creatures? But before he could press for more answers, the ground shook. Alan stumbled slightly, catching himself against a nearby railing. His breath came faster now. What was that? The man grabbed his radio. Sector 7, report. Do you have visuals? Static. Then, a guttural snarl. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the trees. Alan's chest tightened. The man immediately reached for his rifle, his posture rigid. Ready? Get inside. No. Alan's instincts screamed at him to move, but he couldn't. His eyes were locked on the shifting shadows just beyond the clearing. Then the beast emerged, and Alan's world tilted. This wasn't a dinosaur. It was something else entirely. A creature that should not exist. A creature that defied everything he knew about evolution. And it was hunting them. Alan's muscles locked. His instincts screamed at him to run, hide, do something, but he couldn't. His breath hitched as he stared at the impossible creature stepping from the shadows. It wasn't just big. It was wrong. The shape was almost familiar. Reptilian, predatory, but distorted. Its long, sinewy limbs bent at unnatural angles. Its massive claws clicking against the earth with deliberate precision. The thing's head was too large for its body, its jaws jagged and asymmetrical, like it had been built from different creatures stitched together. And then it did something that froze Alan's blood. It tilted its head and grinned. Not an animal's snarl, not a mindless predator baring its teeth, a grin. A recognition. Alan's stomach dropped. This thing was intelligent. The man beside him, the one who had dragged him into this mess, didn't hesitate. Inside? No. Alan finally snapped out of his paralysis and moved. The creature lunged. A blur of muscle and claws ripped through the space they had just occupied. Alan barely made it through the reinforced door as the man slammed it shut behind him, the heavy lock clicking into place. For a moment, there was silence. Then a thud. The door shuddered. Alan pressed his back against the cold metal, his breath coming in ragged gasps. What the hell was that? The man's face was grim. Something we were never meant to create. Alan's vision blurred. You created that. The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the control panel on the wall, pressing a sequence of buttons. A row of security monitors flickered to life, casting an eerie glow across the darkened interior. Alan's eyes widened. The cameras didn't just show this facility. They showed the entire island. Some screens displayed the Triceratops herd moving cautiously through the jungle. Others showed brachiosaurs grazing peacefully by a river. But several monitors, the ones flashing in red, showed something much worse. The creature wasn't alone. There were more of them. Alan turned sharply. What the hell is going on here? The man exhaled. Welcome to Project Genesis, Dr. Porter. Alan's stomach turned. He had spent his entire life searching for lost history. But this wasn't just history. This was a biological disaster waiting to happen. The man continued, his voice tight. You think this island is some kind of prehistoric miracle, right? A place where dinosaurs somehow survived time. He shook his head. It's not. Alan frowned. Then what is it? The man's jaw clenched. It's a lab. Alan's breath caught. No, that wasn't possible. He had studied every piece of available research, every ancient anomaly, every genetic mystery. There was no recorded evidence of human interference on this scale. But the proof was right in front of him. Alan's mind raced. You created all of them. The Triceratops, the brachiosaurs, everything. The man nodded. Some, yes. Others, we didn't plan for. Alan felt sick. What do you mean, didn't plan for? The man pressed a few more buttons. A new screen lit up. Alan's breath stalled. It was a containment chamber. Or at least, what was left of it. The reinforced walls had been torn open from the inside. Scratches and deep gouges covered every surface. Metal bent outward like something had fought to get free. Alan turned toward the man, his voice low. "What did you make?" The man finally met his eyes. "We tried to push boundaries," he admitted. "Not just dinosaurs. Something more. A hybrid." Alan felt his skin crawl. Hybrids. They hadn't just brought back prehistoric creatures. They had made something new. And now it was loose. The security alarm suddenly blared. Both men snapped their heads to the monitors. Sector 7, containment breach. Alan's pulse pounded. On the screen, the distorted creatures were moving fast, converging towards something. His chest tightened. The Triceratops herd. Alan took a step back. "We have to stop them." The man clenched his jaw. "We can't." Alan's temper flared. "So you're just going to let them die? The dinosaurs you created?" The man's expression darkened. "They were never supposed to survive this long." Alan felt like he had been punched. The realization sank in like a stone in his gut. This wasn't about protecting the island. It was about erasing the evidence. Alan shook his head. "You're not scientists. You're cleanup crew." The man didn't deny it. Alan's fist clenched. "Well, I'm not letting that happen." Before the man could stop him, Alan bolted. Alan's lungs burned. The jungle rushed past him, branches snagging at his clothes. He had no plan, no backup, just one goal: reach the Triceratops herd before it was too late. His mind raced through 1,000 possibilities. Could he distract the creatures? Lure them away? As he broke through the tree lean, he saw them. The herd was defensive, but cornered. The monstrous hybrids circled them, their twisted forms barely visible in the moonlight. Alan's gut twisted. He had seconds to decide. He picked up a rock and threw it. The clang against the metal structure echoed through the clearing. The creatures snapped their heads toward him. Alan's breath caught. Bad idea. They turned toward him. Fast. The first one lunged. Alan braced himself for impact. But before it could reach him, something massive slammed into it. Alan stumbled backward. His eyes widened. The female Triceratops, the one who had saved him before, had saved him again. And this time, she wasn't alone. The herd charged. Horned titans collided with the twisted creatures. The ground shook with impact. Alan saw claws rip, horns pierce, bodies thrash in a desperate struggle. But the hybrids were fast. Too fast. One of them broke past the fight, straight for Alan. Alan couldn't move. Then a gunshot. The creature stumbled. Alan turned sharply. The man from the lab stood at the edge of the clearing, rifle still smoking. For the first time, Alan saw it, hesitation in his eyes. A choice. Protect the operation, or protect life. Another shot rang out, and the man chose. The hybrid fell, and for the first time since he arrived on the island, Alan felt hope. Alan's heartbeat pounded in his ears as the chaos unfolded before him. The Triceratops herd fought with everything they had, their massive horns clashing against the abominations that had been let loose. The female Triceratops, the one who had protected him before, was leading the charge. Her powerful legs kicked up dirt as she slammed her weight into one of the hybrids, sending it crashing into a tree. But the creatures were fast. Too fast. One of them dodged the Triceratops' charge, weaving through the battle with unnatural speed. It locked onto Alan. Alan barely had time to react. The thing lunged. He dove aside at the last second, feeling the rush of air as claws ripped through the space he had just occupied. He hit the ground hard, his camera slamming into his ribs. The creature snarled, reorienting. Alan's mind raced. He had no weapons, no real way to fight back. He was about to be torn apart. Then another gunshot rang out. The hybrid jerked violently, its shoulder blasting open with a spray of dark blood. It let out a terrible, almost human-like screech before collapsing to the ground. Alan turned sharply. The man from the lab, his former captor, now his only real ally, lowered his rifle. Alan's breath came ragged. "You could have killed me." The man exhaled, stepping forward. "Don't tempt me." There was no time for arguments. The battle was still raging. The Triceratops were holding their own, but the hybrids were relentless. Alan gritted his teeth. "We have to end this." The man adjusted his rifle. Working on it, Alan followed his gaze and realized what he meant. There was a fuel drum, half buried near the edge of the clearing, a leftover from whatever experiments had been conducted here. If they could ignite it, Alan's stomach tightened. It was a hell of a risk, but so was doing nothing. The man pulled something from his vest, a flare gun. Alan's breath hitched. "You came prepared." The man's face was grim. "We always do." One of the hybrids broke away from the fight, charging straight for them. The man fired. The flare streaked through the air, striking the drum. For a second, nothing. Then the world exploded. The fireball ripped through the clearing, sending hybrids screeching into the night. The impact threw Alan backward. His ears rang, his vision blurred. When the dust settled, silence. The hybrids were gone. The Triceratops stood victorious, their massive forms outlined by the flickering glow of the fire. Alan slowly got to his feet. He turned toward the man, breathless. "That was insane." The man exhaled. "Welcome to Project Genesis." Alan looked at the herd, at the creatures that should have been extinct, at the living, breathing history standing before him. And he knew he couldn't let this be erased. The jungle was quiet again. The fire from the explosion still flickered in the distance, casting a dull orange glow over the battlefield. The hybrids were gone. Their twisted bodies lay in the scorched earth, defeated not by bullets, but by a force they couldn't overcome, nature fighting back. The Triceratops herd stood victorious, their bodies covered in scrapes and bruises, but they had won. The female Triceratops, the one who had saved Alan more than once, let out a deep, rumbling call. A victory cry. Alan felt his chest tighten. He had never witnessed anything like this. Not in his years of research. Not in his wildest dreams. This was more than history. It was life itself, fighting to survive. He turned toward the man, the one who had dragged him into this world of secrets and betrayals. The man who had, at the last moment, chosen to help. Alan's jaw tightened. "Tell me the truth," he said, his voice low. "What happens now?" The man's expression was unreadable. He was silent for a long moment, watching the herd as they began to move again, retreating into the jungle. Then he finally spoke. "You leave." Alan's stomach turned. "And the dinosaurs?" The man exhaled. "The project is finished. Genesis is shutting down." Alan shook his head. "You're going to erase them." The man hesitated, and that was all Alan needed to see. That was the plan. Destroy the evidence. Cover it up. Make sure no one ever knew this place existed. Alan's fingers curled into fists. "These creatures deserve to live," he said, his voice rising. "You saw it yourself. They fight, they adapt, they survive. You don't get to decide if they should exist." The man met his gaze, and for the first time, Alan saw doubt in his eyes. But then a low rumble shook the ground. Alan's breath caught. The female Triceratops, the one who had protected him, who had saved his life, hadn't left. She stood at the edge of the jungle, watching him. Alan felt something deep in his bones. A choice. He had come here looking for answers. But he had found something else. A responsibility. The herd wasn't just ancient relics. They were alive, and he wasn't going to let them be erased. Alan turned back to the man. "You want me to leave," he said. "Fine, but I'm not leaving without them." The man frowned. "You don't understand." "I understand enough," Alan snapped. "This isn't a research site anymore. It's their home." The man hesitated. Then finally he nodded. Alan exhaled sharply. The fight wasn't over. He would have to keep them safe. He would have to make sure no one came back to finish what Genesis started. But for now, they had won. He turned toward the jungle, toward the Triceratops waiting for him. And he followed them home. The wind rolled over the jungle, rustling the massive ferns and towering trees as Alan crouched on a rocky ledge, binoculars raised. The valley below him stretched endlessly, bathed in the golden glow of the setting sun. The Triceratops herd was thriving. The female, the one Alan had come to call Sarah, stood at the front, her head raised high as she guided the younger ones toward the riverbank. The scars from the battle against the hybrids were still faintly visible along her frill, but she moved with undeterred strength. Alan smiled to himself. They had survived, but the fight wasn't over. He lowered the binoculars and pulled out a weathered notebook, flipping through the pages. Over the past few weeks, he had mapped the entire territory, tracking the movements of the remaining dinosaurs, the patterns of the jungle, the areas still untouched by Genesis interference, and most importantly, the signs of new threats. Because Project Genesis wasn't the only danger this island had ever faced. Alan's jaw tightened as he glanced at a small makeshift radio resting on the ground beside him. He hadn't used it, not once. He knew the second he made contact with the outside world, they would come. Governments, corporations, scientists, people who saw dinosaurs as a resource, not as life. And he wasn't about to let that happen. Sarah let out a low rumbling call below, and Alan exhaled, setting the binoculars aside. He had no way of knowing how long he could keep this up. But he had made his choice. This wasn't just a research expedition anymore. It was his home. The days bled together in a rhythm of survival. Alan had built a proper camp near a cliffside, tucked away from Genesis ruins, away from the battle site. With each sunrise, he patrolled the jungle, ensuring the herd was safe. The ecosystem remained undisturbed. He learned their habits, the way they gathered around specific watering holes, the way they migrated between feeding grounds. They trusted him now. Even Sarah, once wary, now allowed him to move among them freely. But not everything had settled into peace. Because the jungle was changing. Alan had seen the signs, footprints too large to belong to anything he had encountered before, distant guttural roars echoing through the valley. Something else was out there. And one morning, he found proof. Alan was tracking the herd's movements near a ravine when he saw it, deep claw marks carved into the trees, impossibly high, impossibly wide. His breath hitched. This wasn't a leftover from hybrids. This was something bigger. His fingers traced the gouges in the bark, heart pounding. Had Project Genesis created something else? Or had something been here long before them? A twig snapped behind him. Alan froze. His instincts screamed at him to stay perfectly still. A low, rasping breath exhaled from the foliage. Alan slowly reached for his knife, not that it would do much against whatever was watching him. Then the sound stopped. Silence. Alan turned sharply, but the jungle was empty. But he knew better. Whatever it was watching him too. And it wasn't afraid. Alan didn't sleep that night. Not after what he had seen. The claw marks were fresh. Whatever had left them was big enough to rival the largest predators in history, and worse, it was watching him. He had spent weeks studying the Triceratops, tracking their movements, ensuring their safety. He had learned every sound of the jungle. But this was new. Alan sat near the dying embers of his campfire, his back against a large boulder, eyes scanning the tree line. The jungle had an unnatural stillness. Even the nocturnal creatures, the chirping insects, the rustling birds, had gone silent, and that was never a good sign. Alan tightened his grip on his makeshift spear. He knew it wouldn't do much against a true apex predator, but it was better than nothing. Then, just as the first traces of dawn began to lighten the sky, a roar, deep, echoing, a sound that didn't belong to any dinosaur Alan had encountered. His pulse spiked. He grabbed his binoculars, scanning the valley from the ridge above his camp. Nothing moved. But then he saw them. The Triceratops herd. They were on the move. Fast. Too fast. Alan's stomach tightened. They weren't just migrating. They were fleeing. Sarah was at the front, pushing the younger ones forward, her muscles tensed, her head turning sharply toward the trees. Alan followed her gaze. And then he saw it. The jungle shifted, leaves trembling, entire trees swaying as something massive moved through them. Alan's breath hitched. It was still hidden, but its outline, its silhouette was there, and it was following the herd. Alan moved instinctively. He grabbed his gear, slung his pack over his shoulder, and bolted toward the valley. Whatever was hunting them, he had to stop it. The sun had fully risen by the time Alan caught up with the herd. The Triceratops were uneasy, their movements frantic. They had clustered together near a steep incline, their tails swishing, eyes wide, snorting anxiously. Alan had never seen them this panicked. He approached slowly, hands raised in a calming gesture. easy," he murmured. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Because the jungle behind him suddenly went dead silent. Alan stopped. The herd stopped. The wind stopped. Then a branch snapped. Alan turned, and he finally saw it. Stepping from the shadows, the beast revealed itself, and Alan's mind refused to believe what he was seeing. It was a dinosaur, but not one he recognized. It was massive, larger than even the T-Rex, but its form was wrong. Its arms were too long, ending in jagged claws that looked capable of slicing through steel. Its skin was dark, almost black, streaked with unnatural red veins. But the worst part, its eyes, they weren't reptilian. They were something else. They were aware. Alan's heart pounded. This thing wasn't just a predator. It was something Genesis had left behind. A failed experiment. A monster. And it was staring directly at him. Alan's mind raced. This wasn't like the hybrids. This thing wasn't just a mix of creatures. It was something entirely new. It was Genesis' final secret. Alan took a slow step back. He knew he couldn't outrun it. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. Because he wasn't alone. The Triceratops herd stirred behind him. Alan knew how they fought. He had seen it before. They were a family. And this wasn't just his fight. It was theirs too. The massive predator let out a low, guttural growl, stepping forward, testing him. Alan didn't flinch. Instead, he took a step closer to Sarah. The female Triceratops let out a deep snort. Her muscles tensed. She understood. Alan's breath came steady now. "We stand together," he whispered. The predator let out a final snarl. And then the battle began.